The client seemed terrified, so I ran straight back to the pool area. Dave had managed to contain the snake until I arrived, and when I saw it, I realized why he needed help. This thing was fast and big.
There are shows that get canceled, and people shrug it off within a week. The time slot fills up, something else comes along, and life moves on. Then there are shows that disappear without a word, no finale, no send-off, no explanation. And years later people are still typing the name into a search bar, still wanting to know what went wrong. Billy the Exterminator is very much in that second category. For 6 seasons on A&E, William Billy Bretherton was one of the most genuinely distinctive personalities on reality television. Not the manufactured kind of distinctive, where a network hands someone a quirky catchphrase and calls it a character. We're talking about a man who showed up to remove a 12-foot alligator from a drainage canal wearing all black leather, silver rings on every finger, and the kind of calm, methodical confidence that made you believe he'd done this 100 times, because he had. He was a trained entomologist, a U.S. Air Force veteran, a family man, and a heavy metal enthusiast all at once, and none of those things seemed to contradict each other when you watched him work. The show built a real following. Not a flashy, trend-driven following, a loyal one. The kind where people set reminders and watched live and told their friends to tune in. And then, without any kind of proper goodbye, it stopped. A&E went quiet. Billy went quiet. And fans were left with nothing but confusion and a gap in their Tuesday night lineup. So what actually happened? Because the story behind why Billy the Exterminator ended is not a simple one. It's not just a cancellation. It's the story of a drug arrest, a fractured family, a business falling apart from the inside, and a network that decided the easiest move was to say nothing at all. Let's go through all of it. Before we get into how it all came apart, it's worth spending some real time on why it worked in the first place, because that context is everything when it comes to understanding the ending. William Bretherton grew up in Benton, Louisiana, a small city in Bossier Parish in the northwest corner of the state. Louisiana is a place with a specific kind of ecological intensity. The heat, the humidity, the bayous, the proximity to water, all of it creates an environment where the animal kingdom and human civilization are constantly bumping up against each other in ways they simply don't in most of the country. Snakes in garage walls, feral hogs at the edge of subdivisions, wasp colonies the size of a washing machine nested under a back porch. Growing up there, Billy had an early and unavoidable education in what it meant to share your space with creatures that didn't care about property lines. He joined the U.S. Air Force at 19. What's notable about his military service isn't just that he served, it's that the Air Force ran evaluations that flagged a strong aptitude for entomology and biology. He was trained systematically in pest management and pest control as part of his service role, eventually reaching the rank of senior airman and spending time stationed at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. This wasn't a hobby he picked up later. The foundation of his expertise was institutional and formal, built during his years in the military before he ever had a camera pointed at him. After his discharge, he came back to Louisiana and joined Vexcan Animal and Pest Control, the family business, built and operated by his parents, Big Bill and Donnie Bretherton. His brother Ricky was also part of the operation. This was a working business with real clients and real jobs, not a television construct. That fact becomes very important later. His first significant on-camera exposure came through the Discovery Channel series Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe, which featured people working in unusual or physically demanding occupations. Billy appeared in a segment, and something clicked. He was completely natural in front of the camera, knowledgeable without being stiff, funny without trying to be, and utterly unintimidated by a lens pointed at his face. A&E saw the footage and saw show. In 2009, A&E launched the Exterminators, following Billy and the Vexcan team through their daily work. The response was strong enough that by season 2, the show had been rebranded around its undeniable center of gravity, Billy himself. Billy the Exterminator ran for 6 seasons and never seriously struggled for an audience. The reason for that success is worth examining carefully. Reality television has a long history of manufacturing personalities, constructing an image, casting to a type, editing to a narrative. Billy was none of that. The leather was real. The heavy metal background was real. The family was real. The expertise was real. When he knelt down next to a wasp nest and started explaining the colony structure and the queen's role in maintaining it, that wasn't a producer feeding him lines. That was a man who had genuinely spent years learning everything he could about the creatures he was being paid to remove. That authenticity is precisely what made the show's ending so hard to absorb. Because when reality television is genuine, when it's actually documenting something real, losing it means losing something that can't be reconstructed. Part of what made Billy the Exterminator hold up over 6 seasons was the format itself, which had a kind of built-in variety that kept it from going stale. Each episode typically followed Billy and the Mexican crew through multiple calls, and the calls covered an extraordinary range. Louisiana's climate produces year-round pest activity and supports wildlife that most American viewers had only ever seen on nature channels. One job might be a residential beehive removal, tens of thousands of bees inside a wall that needed to be extracted without destroying the structure, and ideally without killing every bee in the colony. The next might be an alligator that had wandered into a neighborhood retention pond and needed to be safely relocated before someone's child got too close. Then a nutria rat problem near a waterway. Then a fire ant colony in a backyard that had grown to a size most people wouldn't believe. The variety wasn't manufactured. It came naturally from the environment and from the nature of a real pest control business. And because the show was documenting genuine work calls rather than setting up stage challenges, there was an unpredictability to each episode that no amount of scripting could replicate. One of the more quietly interesting aspects of the production was a technique that Billy and Ricky developed almost organically. Because the camera crew never knew in advance which footage would end up in the final cut, the brothers got into the habit of narrating their work in real time, explaining the species they were dealing with, describing the behavior pattern that made it dangerous or problematic, walking through each step of the removal process as they performed it. This meant that no matter which angle the editors used or which moment made the cut, the essential information was already captured in the footage. It made the show more educational than many of its competitors in the genre, and it made the viewer feel like they were actually learning something rather than just being entertained. The family dynamic added a warmth that the pest control genre doesn't usually offer. Big Bill and Donnie weren't background characters. They were active participants in the business and in the show's emotional texture. Ricky was a genuinely skilled exterminator in his own right, not just a sidekick. Billy's wife Mary appeared in earlier seasons, though she eventually stepped back from filming, reportedly due to personal discomfort with the camera rather than any dramatic reason, though the specifics were never fully discussed publicly. By any conventional television metric, Billy the Exterminator was a show that had every reason to continue. It had found its audience, it had a reliable format, and had a central personality who was genuinely irreplaceable. But there's a version of that irreplaceability that works against a show rather than for it. When everything depends on one specific person in one specific set of circumstances, the entire enterprise is only ever as stable as that person's life. And in 2012, that life started to come apart. In 2012, Billy and his wife Mary were arrested in Bossier Parish. According to reporting at the time, the couple was found in possession of synthetic marijuana, a substance that existed in a complicated legal gray area during that period, as federal and state authorities were actively working to classify and criminalize various synthetic cannabinoids that had been sold legally as recently as a year or two prior. The legal outcome was genuinely minor. Billy pleaded guilty, received a $500 fine, and was ordered to complete community service hours. By the standards of what reality television personalities have survived over the years, it barely registers. But the effect on the show was not minor, and understanding why requires understanding something about how reality television works as a cultural product. Scripted television has a useful separation between the performer and the role. When a fictional character commits a crime on screen, the actor playing that character remains distinct. Audiences can and routinely do hold those two identities separately. An arrest or a scandal involving an actor creates tabloid coverage and awkward interviews, but it doesn't destabilize the show itself because the character still exists as a fictional entity that lives outside the actor's personal life. Reality television eliminates that separation entirely. The person on screen is the product. Their life, their personality, their relationships, their values, all of it is what audiences have been sold. When something contradicts the image they've been given, there is no fictional buffer to absorb the impact. The person and the persona collapse into the same thing, and the damage to one is automatically damage to the other. For A&E, Billy's arrest created a specific branding problem. The network had spent years positioning him as an eccentric but wholesome working-class hero, a family man who ran a family business, loved animals, kept his community safe from infestations, and happened to look like he belonged at a concert instead of a truck stop. A drug charge, even a small one, even a guilty plea that resulted in nothing more serious than a fine, introduced a crack in that image. It gave critics and advertisers a reason to ask questions. It made the narrative more complicated than the network wanted it to be. Networks in this space generally respond to complications around talent in one of two ways. They get out in front of it publicly and manage the story, or they quietly step back and hope the story fades. A&E chose the latter, and that choice would prove to have consequences for how the show's end was handled. Here is the part of the story that doesn't get nearly enough attention, possibly because it happened largely out of public view, and possibly because the people involved chose to keep it that way. In the months following the arrest, serious tensions developed within the Bretherton family. The exact nature of those tensions was never publicly disclosed in detail. Billy himself was private about the specifics in the interviews and public appearances he made during that period. But the outcome was not private at all. Billy left Vexkin. He parted ways with the family business that had been the structural foundation of the entire show. And he didn't just move across town, he relocated to Illinois, hundreds of miles from Benton, Louisiana, hundreds of miles from his parents, hundreds of miles from his brother, away from the bayous and the back roads and the particular ecosystem that had made the show what it was. Think about what that move actually meant for the show's survival. Billy the Exterminator was not a format that could be picked up and relocated. It wasn't a game show with a set or a talk show with a studio. It was a documentary series about a specific family running a specific business in a specific place. Every element that made it work, the location, the supporting cast, the business itself, the texture of southern Louisiana, was geographically and personally fixed. When Billy walked away from Vexkin and moved to a different state, he didn't just leave the business. He dismantled the show's entire premise. A&E had no practical path to continue production. They couldn't recast Billy's parents or his brother. They couldn't replicate the Louisiana setting in Illinois. They couldn't rebuild what had existed organically over years. The show had already ended in the only way that mattered, in real life. The network's official cancellation was just paperwork. What makes this painful for fans is the absence of any explanation or closure. A&E made no public statement about why the show was ending. There was no final season arc that acknowledged the situation. No farewell episode where Billy addressed the audience directly. Season 6 aired, the episode stopped coming, and that was it. For viewers who had been watching since 2009, the silence was the worst part. Billy Bretherton made an attempt to keep the spirit of the show alive with a YouTube series called Billy the Exterminators, launched in 2015. It ran for 16 episodes. Without Billy as the gravitational center of the operation, the chemistry simply wasn't the same. The series never gained meaningful traction, and it eventually stopped updating. The network's response to the collapse of Billy the Exterminator tells you something worth knowing about how A&E operated during that era, and how reality television networks handle messy endings in general. A&E's silence was not accidental or negligent. It was a deliberate strategy. If the network had released a statement explaining that the show was ending because of a drug arrest and a family falling out, they would have been drawing more attention to a story they were trying to quietly exit. The cleanest move, from a purely tactical standpoint, was to say nothing. Let the show disappear from the schedule, avoid prolonging the news cycle, and move on to the next thing. It's also important to understand where A&E was as a network at that moment. By 2012 and 2013, the network was experiencing the Duck Dynasty phenomenon, a reality series about the Robertson family's duck coal manufacturing business in Louisiana that had become one of the highest-rated cable programs in years. Duck Dynasty was generating numbers that dwarfed everything else on A&E's schedule, and the network's attention and resources were heavily concentrated around protecting and extending that success. Billy the Exterminator was a reliable mid-tier performer. It wasn't a liability when it was working, but it also wasn't the flagship. When the production circumstances became complicated, the institutional will to fight for it simply wasn't there. This is a dynamic in television that audiences rarely think about. Shows don't always end because the ratings collapsed. Sometimes they end because the circumstances that made them possible stopped existing, and the network that holds the rights decides that rebuilding those circumstances costs more than it's worth. With Billy the Exterminator, the practical foundation dissolved, no location, no family unit, no business, and A&E let it go rather than attempt a reconstruction. The result was a gap in the reality programming landscape that, by most accounts, was never adequately filled. Several pest control and wildlife handling shows followed in subsequent years, but none of them captured the combination of genuine expertise, family warmth, and idiosyncratic personality that made Billy's show worth watching. You can replicate the format. You cannot replicate the person. Billy was not finished with television, as it turned out. After a few years out of the public eye, he got another opportunity from an unexpected direction. In 2016, CMT Canada approached him about a new series. The concept was relatively simple: bring Billy to Canada, document his pest and animal control work in a new geographical environment, and see how his on-screen presence translated outside the Louisiana context. The result was Billy Goes North, a 12-episode series that premiered on CMT Canada in 2016. The show worked. Fans who found it were largely enthusiastic about it. Billy's comfort in front of the camera had not diminished in the years he'd been away from television. He was still immediately recognizable, still knowledgeable, still funny in the natural way that couldn't be scripted. Canada offered a different set of wildlife and pest challenges than Louisiana, but the core dynamic of watching a skilled, genuinely interesting person do difficult work with evident competence and care translated without friction. A&E took notice, and in 2017 aired a version of Billy Goes North in the United States, presenting it to audiences as what amounted to a 7th and final season of the original series. For viewers who had been waiting 5+ years for any kind of continuation, it was a welcome surprise, even if it felt a little disconnected from where the show had originally left off. But that one Canadian season was the full extent of the revival. After Billy Goes North concluded, there was no announcement of additional seasons, no development deal, no indication that a full return to the original format was being planned. Billy stepped back from television again, this time with the quiet finality of someone who had made peace with a chapter being over. Why didn't the revival go further? Several factors likely converged. The gap between the original show and the Canadian project was long enough that rebuilding a mainstream American audience from the ground up would have required real, sustained investment from A&E, marketing money, promotional support, a committed multi-season order. It's not clear the network was willing to make that bet on a franchise that had been dormant for years. Billy was also older, and his relationship to the entertainment side of the business had visibly changed. The years away seemed to have recalibrated his priorities in ways that made a full return to weekly production less appealing than it might once have been.